the 18th of July in the year 2001. Black Ridge National Forest, Oregon. Search and Rescue Team Coordinator Thomas Reeves slowly circles parking lot number 17, methodically documenting every detail of the scene that 4 days ago was the Palmer sisters' resting place. The morning sun breaks through the crowns of the pine trees, illuminating a clearing where time seems to have stood still. 2 hiking backpacks, one dark green, the other with blue inserts, stand neatly next to the tent, slightly damp from the morning dew. The thermometer reads 57 degrees Fahrenheit. The camp looks like its occupants will be back any minute. Melissa and Jessica Palmer, 26 and 24 years old, arrived here last Thursday, planning a 3-day hike along the Eagles Point Trail. Their car, a silver Toyota Camry 2000-year-old, is still parked in the parking lot at the start of the trail. Inside the car is a trail map with marked rest points and a cell phone with a dead battery in the glove compartment. The last call from it was made at 16 hours and 30 minutes Thursday night, a message to his parents that the hike had safely begun. "Everything here is just too neat," Reeves notes into the recorder as he circles the perimeter of the campground. There are no signs of struggle or panic, nothing to indicate an animal attack. The sisters' tent is still perfectly set up, a navy blue dome with silver stretches securely anchored into the rocky ground. Inside, 2 sleeping bags are spread out parallel, a small travel pillow on each. Flashlights lie side by side, batteries charged. In the corner are 2 pairs of spare socks and a small volume of Emily Dickinson's poetry with a bookmark on page 24. In the tent pockets are insect repellent, sunscreen, and 2 packs of wet wipes. Near the extinguished fire pit on a flat rock is an unfinished game of Phase 10. The cards are laid out as if the players had just taken a break. A plastic box of canned and packaged freeze-dried food stands under a waterproof awning. 6 water bottles are lined up in a row. One is open, with about a quarter sipped from it. 5 meters from the camp is a small cleared area with a shovel for a field toilet. A little farther away is a trail of recently cut branches. The sisters were apparently gathering wood for an evening campfire. The disappearance began with silence. The parents, Robert and Karen Palmer, became concerned when they didn't receive the expected message from their daughters Sunday night. Melissa, the oldest of the sisters, always sent a text message upon returning from a camping trip. By Monday morning, an alert was issued when both failed to show up for work. 20 years working in search and rescue, and I've never seen anything like this, Reeves admits, making final notes in a notebook. It's like they've just erased from the place. The first official statement from the Oregon State Police came 48 hours after the discovery of the empty campground. The disappearance of 2 women in the Black Ridge Range area is under investigation. All versions of what happened are being considered at this time. In the first days of the search, the woods filled with voices. More than 50 volunteers scoured 30 square miles of dense forest, their flashlights cutting through the night fog, and cries of "Melissa! Jessica!" echoed off the rock ledges. Helicopters with thermal imaging scanners circled the area during daylight hours, methodically dividing the terrain into squares. Search dogs, having gotten a scent from the clothes at the Palmer house, circled restlessly around the camp, but the trail ended about 100 meters northwest of the parking lot. On the 6th day of the search, the first breakthrough, and simultaneously the first ominous omen, occurred. Ranger Michael Donovan found a woman's hiking boot half submerged in the waters of Crater Creek, about 2 miles from the sisters' registered parking lot. Karen Palmer confirmed The boot belonged to Melissa. Crater Creek is in the opposite direction from the route the sisters planned to take, explains Detective Marcus Wilson of the Oregon State Police, studying a map of the area. It makes it appear that they deliberately changed the route, or were forced to do so. The search area immediately shifted toward the creek bed. Divers surveyed deep areas for fear of uncovering evidence of the tragedy. The banks of the creek for 5 miles were scoured with the utmost care. Nothing. Just a lone shoe, size 7.5, with the inscription Mel partially obliterated on the inside. Karen Palmer, holding her daughter's school photos, spoke to the TV cameras on the 12th day of the search. Her voice shook, but her determination was evident. Melissa always sends messages when they reach the top. Jessica keeps a detailed log of each hike. This silence isn't like them at all. My girls didn't just disappear. Something happened, and we have to find them. On the 14th day, the National Guard joined the search. The area of the operation expanded to 50 square miles, including the hard-to-reach crevices and caves in the northern part of the reservation. All life in the small town of Pinewood, where the sisters were from, centered around the search. The local church has become a focal point. The school gym became a recreation center for search teams. The walls of public buildings were covered with pictures of the Palmer sisters. We weren't just looking for people, recalls Sarah Jenkins, an old friend of Jessica's who participated in the search. We were looking for a piece of our town. Melissa worked at the local library and knew every kid by name. Jessica taught high school biology and organized environmental expeditions. They are part of us. After a month, the intensity of the search began to wane. Resources were dwindling. Hopes were melting. The Federal Bureau of Investigation, which joined the operation in the 3rd week, provided profilers and enhanced capabilities to analyze the evidence. But the result remained the same: a complete absence of meaningful traces. 6 months later, Detective Marcus Wilson of the Oregon State Police had to come clean to the Palmer family. Without new evidence, the case would likely go from active investigation to periodic review status. The official version leaned toward a wilderness accident, perhaps a fall off a cliff in a remote part of the preserve, or an encounter with a predator. Robert Palmer refused to accept this explanation. After mortgaging the family home, he hired private investigator Alan Morris, a former FBI agent with 30 years of experience. Morris was interested in another aspect of the case: the strange coincidences in the dates. 7 hikers have disappeared within a 100-mile radius of Black Ridge in the last 15 years, Morris explained, as he spread the photos out on the table. 3 of them are couples. The disappearances have been at intervals of about 2 or 3 years, always in the summer, always in remote areas, and always without a trace. Morris's theory found no official support. A 6-month private investigation ended with dwindling funds and no breakthrough. But Karen Palmer found a constructive outlet for her grief. She founded Wildlife Watch, a volunteer organization that set up a network of checkpoints on hiking trails and educated visitors on safety protocols. Meanwhile, the missing sisters' notices, once bright and crisp on public boards and roadside stops in 3 states, gradually faded in the relentless sun and rain. Their smiling faces faded. The edges of the paper creased inward. But the memory remained sharp. No one in Pinewood could have imagined that 4 years later, the silence would be broken in the most shocking way. Dear viewers, if you've been gripped by this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a comment, and put a like. This incredibly helps YouTube's algorithms recognize the value of this content and show it to more people interested in investigative documentaries. Every interaction you have is like a vote for this story to be heard. October 12th, 2005. 23 hours and 42 minutes. Pineview Gas and Grocery Gas Station, located at mile 53 of the Cascade Highway, 52 miles south of where the Palmer sisters disappeared. Weather conditions: heavy rain, gusty winds up to 40 miles per hour. Visibility less than 100 yards. Henry Moss, a 41-year-old night shift worker, was monotonously counting packs of cigarettes behind the counter when the electronic doorbell emitted a sharp beep. The black and white surveillance footage showed the door swing open, letting in jets of rain and a hunched human figure. At first I thought it was some vagrant or drunk, Moss later recalled in an interview with local television. Half her face was hidden by her hair, her clothes looked like rags, and then she collapsed. Security camera footage, examined frame by investigators, preserved the moment of the fall. An emaciated woman with disheveled hair crawling across the linoleum. Her clothes, something between a tattered jacket and hand-stitched fabric fragments, covered in dried mud. Her lips move, uttering, "Palmer, Jessica Palmer," whereupon she passes out under the relentless light of fluorescent bulbs. I jumped over the counter, checked my pulse. It was weak but steady, Moss recounts. As I dialed 911, she started having seizures. The dispatcher advised putting something under her head and keeping her from choking. It was the longest 13 minutes of my life. An ambulance from the city of Bridgeport arrived at 23 hours and 55 minutes. Paramedics Ryan Chen and Alicia Rodriguez documented the initial observations. Patient, believed to be female, 25 to 30 years old, extremely emaciated, signs of dehydration, multiple scars and healed fractures. Clothing is out of season, homemade from various materials. Body temperature is 96.2 degrees Fahrenheit. When news of the woman, who identified herself as Jessica Palmer, reached the Cascade County Sheriff's Office, Duty Sergeant Mike Holleran immediately contacted the Pinewood Police Department. Within 20 minutes, the information reached Detective Marcus Wilson, still in charge of the Palmer case. "We didn't want to give false hope to the family," Wilson explains. "There have been 17 false reports about the Palmer sisters in 4 years, ranging from good faith misconceptions to deliberate cruel pranks. But this case was different. The woman knew her name, and a preliminary comparison with photographs of the missing showed an unmistakable resemblance despite the emaciation. At St. Elizabeth District Hospital in Bridgeport, doctors and nurses in the emergency room were faced with a clinical picture that went beyond standard protocols. Dr. Amanda Chow, the trauma surgeon on duty, later published a detailed description of the patient's condition on admission in the Oregon Medical Journal. The patient showed signs of long-term emaciation, avidominosis, and significant muscle atrophy, particularly in the lower extremities, Dr. Chow wrote. Multiple healed fractures of the ribs, left forearm, and 3 fingers of the right hand. Of particular note were symmetrical circular burn scars on both shoulders and upper back, as well as characteristic marks from prolonged friction of ropes or other restraints on the wrists and ankles. At 3 hours and 45 minutes on the morning of October 13th, after the patient's condition had stabilized, a preliminary comparison of the dental records was made. The result left no doubt. The woman was indeed Jessica Palmer, missing for 4 years and 87 days. "I cried when I got the confirmation," admits nurse Ellen Nguyen. "All of us here in Oregon knew the story. Their pictures hung in every public place for years. It was like a miracle, a terrible, traumatic miracle. The call to Jessica's parents was made personally by the Cascade County Sheriff's Office at 5 hours and 13 minutes in the morning. Karen and Robert Palmer arrived at the hospital less than 2 hours later, having traveled 84 miles over rain-slicked roads. Jessica Palmer remained in the intensive care unit for 11 days. Medical records, released in part with the family's permission, describe the patient's condition in clinical language that only slightly lifts the veil of the horror she endured. The patient demonstrates symptoms consistent with prolonged captivity and isolation, including sensitivity to light, atrophy of leg muscles, chronic nutritional deficiencies, and psychological trauma requiring specialized intervention. A psychological profile by Dr. Richard Ebbing provides more disturbing details. The subject alternates periods of catatonic silence with bouts of acute anxiety, especially in response to specific triggers, the sound of metal instruments, the smell of pine, male voices of a certain timbre. There is a complex post-traumatic reaction involving elements of survival thinking, dissociation, and heightened vigilance. When Karen Palmer first entered her daughter's hospital room, what Dr. Ebbing later described as the clearest illustration of the depth of trauma occurred. Jessica didn't recognize her mother at first. Instead, huddling against the wall and repeating in a monotone, muffled voice, "He'll find me if I talk. He always finds us when we talk." It wasn't my daughter's voice, Karen Palmer recalled in a single interview a year later. I mean, physically, it was her voice, but the intonation, the rhythm of speech, it was like someone else was speaking through her, like a part of her was still wherever it was. On Jessica's 4th day in the hospital, as news of her miraculous return began to trickle out to the press, FBI Special Agent Diane Crawford arrived from the Portland field office. Crawford, 43, specialized in wilderness abduction victim recovery cases and had a doctorate in clinical psychology with a focus on trauma disorders. "We met with a situation of extreme sensitivity," Crawford explained in a closed briefing to law enforcement. On the one hand, the urgency to get information. Perhaps Jessica's sister is still alive. Perhaps there are other victims. On the other is the psychological fragility of the survivor, for whom premature or traumatic intervention could have disastrous consequences. Crawford developed a specialized communication protocol that allowed Jessica to control the pace and manner in which information was conveyed. When verbal communication proved too difficult, Jessica could write notes, draw, or use a card system with pre-written words. Some survivors of prolonged captivity develop an association between speaking and punishment, explains Dr. Elizabeth Wong, who advised the FBI on the case. Written communication may be perceived as safer, less visible to a potential observer or stalker. On the 8th day of her hospitalization, Jessica wrote her first coherent statement, 7 words that became a turning point in the investigation. Agent Crawford's official case file has preserved this note in its original form, jagged typed letters on hospital note slips. "Melissa tried to save me. She runned for help, but he caught her. He maked me watch what was going on with the runners." That sentence confirmed the investigators' worst suspicions. The sisters were not victims of accident or wildlife. They were abducted, and perhaps they weren't the only ones. The day after that admission, the status of the case was officially changed from missing, presumed dead, to kidnapping with a hold. The Federal Bureau of Investigation took full charge of the case, forming a special task force based in Portland. The race for answers began, a race against time and the fear that somewhere in the Black Ridge Mountains there might be other captives of an unknown kidnapper. Hospital room number 217 at Portland Regional Medical Center. White walls, blinds tightly closed, 8 weeks of interviews, 72 hours of recording, over 400 pages of transcripts. It was here, in this sterile space, that a picture of horror began to emerge from the fragments of Jessica Palmer's memory. FBI Special Agent Diane Crawford methodically built a timeline, creating what would later be called a roadmap to survival. Each session began the same way. Crawford ventilated the room, removed metal objects from view, placed notepads and colored markers on the bedside table. A camera recording what was happening was disguised as a piece of medical equipment. The sudden awareness of the observation could have triggered a severe trigger episode in the patient. We used the countdown memory reconstruction technique, Crawford explains in a training manual published 2 years later for the FBI Academy. Traumatized memory is nonlinear. It is stored in fragments, often tied to sensory experiences. We started with safe memories, the smells of the forest, the sound of a stream, the feel of the sun on the skin. Then we slowly approached the tipping point. By the 3rd week of the interview, Jessica was able to describe the moment of their abduction, the first piece of the puzzle, the close-up at the beginning of the nightmare, July 18th, 2001, approximately 16 hours and 30 minutes. The Palmer sisters were gathering wood for an evening campfire 100 yards from their parking lot. Melissa was finding dry branches. Jessica was marking the way back with bright orange ribbons attached to the branches. It was then that a man appeared from behind the dense vegetation. Tall, bearded, wearing a camouflage jacket with lots of pockets, Jessica recorded in her therapy journal. Seemed normal, confident but not threatening, asked for help, said his friend had twisted his leg about a mile away, asked if we had any painkillers or elastic bandages. According to the Crawford team's reconstruction of events, the initial interaction lasted about 15 minutes. The man introduced himself as David, talked about hiking trails, and demonstrated knowledge of the area. Nothing aroused suspicion. The sisters agreed to follow him to help the injured hiker. He walked ahead, but kept turning around to see if we were following him, Jessica recalled during the 12th session. Asked about our route, about who knew where we were. At one point, he pulled a bottle of water out of his backpack and offered it to us. Melissa declined. I took a sip. I realized now that the water might have been with something in it. After about 3 miles of traveling on unmarked trails, the man suddenly changed. Pulling out a hunting knife, he ordered his sisters to hand over their cell phones and follow along in silence. When Melissa tried to flee, he displayed a gun hidden under his jacket. The destination, as Jessica would later describe, was a masterfully camouflaged manhole in the hillside, covered in natural vegetation and disguised as part of the landscape. The hatch opened into a narrow tunnel leading into the underground complex. Only later did I learn that we should call it the mountain, Jessica wrote in one of her notes. Never by name, only mountain. He said that names were a weakness of civilization, that in the New World, people would be known only by their qualities. A psychological profile of the kidnapper, compiled from Jessica's testimony, paints a portrait of a man with a paranoid worldview, a deep knowledge of survival, and elements of apocalyptic thinking. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit classified him as an organized non-social offender with a messianic complex. He spoke with military precision, Jessica recalled. Every move calculated. knew the names of all the plants in the forest, which were edible, which were medicinal, could identify by ear the type of helicopter flying over the bunker. When night fell, he would sit for hours with a shortwave radio, writing messages in a coded log. Of particular interest to investigators was the description of the shelter. According to Jessica's drawings and notes, the underground complex consisted of 3 main rooms. The first was the main living area of approximately 25 square meters with a primitive kitchen, sleeping quarters, and makeshift shelves filled with books on survival, military tactics, and field medicine. The second was a storage room filled with canned food, water containers, medicine, tools, and survival gear, including ropes, tarps, hunting traps, and camouflage clothing in various sizes. The third room, which Jessica called the pit, was a punishment cell, a depression in the ground about 2.5 meters deep, covered with a metal grate. It was where the sisters were held during the first weeks of captivity, and subsequently after escape attempts. We were only granted access to the main living area on good behavior, Jessica explained. It was his system of control. First isolation, darkness, and starvation, then small privileges for obedience. The basic rule was to never speak when he was away. He claimed to have installed listening devices and punished any sound made in his absence. The domestic routine in the bunker, reconstructed by the investigators, followed a strict schedule. Rising at 5 in the morning, physical exercise, breakfast, consisting mostly of oatmeal and freeze-dried fruit. Then, survival lessons, learning about edible plants, camouflage techniques, and orienting themselves in the terrain. He told us he watched us for 2 days before he captured us, Jessica wrote in her therapy journal. Said we were careless, said he was teaching us how to survive properly, said the world was about to collapse, and only people who learned his ways would survive. One of the most disturbing discoveries for investigators was the description of a collection of newspaper clippings about missing persons that the Mountain kept in a metal container under his bunk. Jessica recalled seeing at least a dozen stories about missing hikers, some dating back to the 90s. Of particular note in Jessica's testimony are the escape attempts made by her sister. According to a timeline compiled by Crawford's team, Melissa Palmer made 7 escape attempts during the first 2 years of captivity. Melissa never gave up, Jessica said during the 18th interview session. She memorized his schedule, marked the days he went farther away or stayed longer. After the 3rd attempt, he started separating us. If one would leave the bunker with him, the other would stay chained inside. Melissa's final 8th escape attempt occurred approximately 2 years after her abduction. According to Jessica's testimony, while camping for supplies about 2 miles from the bunker, Melissa managed to slip away, taking advantage of a moment when the Mountain was busy checking a hunting trap. He was gone for 3 days, Jessica recalled during the 15th session of the interview, her fingers nervously circling the burn scars on her arms. He hunted her. When he came back, he was carrying her backpack and a strand of her hair. He said the mountains had taken her back and that I should be grateful for his protection. Forensic psychologist Dr. Elizabeth Huang, who analyzed taped interviews and therapy sessions with Jessica, noted the formation of a complex trauma response combining resistance and adaptation strategies. We observe a phenomenon known as adaptive dissociation, Dr. Huang explains in her conclusion. On the one hand, the subject has evolved external submission mechanisms to minimize violence. On the other, she consistently implemented a long-term survival strategy, including memorizing the bunker plan, tracking the abductor's routine through tags scratched in the sleeping area, and mentally mapping the surrounding area during infrequent controlled forays outside. A particular focus of Dr. Huang's analysis is what Jessica called her internal map, a mental reconstruction of the surrounding terrain that she created piece by piece during forced hikes with her abductor. Every time I came to the surface, I would memorize one detail, Jessica explained. An unusual tree, a characteristic rock, the direction of the stream's flow. I was drawing these details in my head, creating a map that could one day lead to freedom. By the end of 8 weeks of intensive interviews, the FBI team had enough information to launch full-scale search operations. The timeline of events had been reconstructed, a psychological profile of the kidnapper had been compiled, and the approximate location of the bunker had been determined based on landscape descriptions and calculations of possible distances. We created a model based on cross-country travel speeds, explains FBI geospatial analyst Marcus Reiner. Given the time it took to travel from the parking lot to the bunker, landscape descriptions, and other factors, we were able to determine a probable search area with a 15-mile radius from the original abduction point. The search operation, codenamed Recovery, was ready to begin. But no one could foresee what awaited them in the depths of Blackridge Forest. September of the year 2005, the 4th year of Jessica Palmer's imprisonment. The weather in the Blackridge Mountains is changing, bringing the first rains of fall and a sharp drop in temperature. In the underground bunker, where they depend on a primitive ventilation system and a wood stove to maintain a constant temperature, the humidity reaches a critical level. It is at this point that what investigators would later call a coincidence of circumstances that changed the course of the case occurs. He got sick, Jessica tells Agent Crawford during the 23rd interview. First a cough, then a fever. On the 4th day, he almost couldn't get out of bed. I had to bring him water and monitor his temperature. For the first time in 4 years, he was vulnerable. According to a medical reconstruction by Dr. Raymond Chang of the Center for Infectious Diseases, the kidnapper likely suffered from a severe form of pneumonia exacerbated by living conditions in the underground shelter. The illness progressed over 8 to 9 days, at times leading to a state of near unconsciousness. I knew this was my only chance, Jessica continues, her voice quiet but firm in the taped interview. For a year, I had noticed a weak spot in the ventilation system of the main chamber, a corroded bolt in one of the grills. Every time it was missing, I tried to loosen it a little bit. The bunker's ventilation system, reconstructed by FBI engineers from Jessica's descriptions, was a network of narrow shafts about 30 centimeters in diameter, coming to the surface through disguised openings. The grid Jessica was referring to was about 2 meters off the floor, behind a heavy metal cabinet. I only moved the cabinet when I was sure he was sound asleep, Jessica explains. Worked at night, used a spoon with a sharpened edge to gradually loosen the bolt. Every morning put it all back in place. Disguise was more important than speed. By the 6th day of the kidnapper's illness, the bolt was sufficiently loosened. On the night of October 8th, when the mountain's temperature had risen to a critical point and he had fallen into a feverish sleep, Jessica made a decisive attempt. The opening was barely big enough for my body, she recalls. In 4 years in captivity, I had lost about 20 pounds. My thinness became my salvation. The ventilation shaft, according to later examination, rose vertically for about 4 meters, then turned horizontally and came to the surface after 7 meters. The cross-section of the shaft gradually narrowed, reaching only 25 centimeters at its narrowest point. I crawled through the rocky ground for what seemed like an eternity, she told Agent Crawford. The earth was crumbling, getting in my eyes, in my mouth. At one point, I was stuck, couldn't go forward or backward. I thought I was going to die out there in the dark. Investigators estimate the journey through the ventilation shaft took about 45 minutes. When Jessica finally made it to the surface, it was the middle of the night. The temperature was about 7 degrees Celsius. A fine rain was drizzling. The first thing I remember on the loose was the smell of pine trees and the sound of night insects, Jessica describes. I didn't know where I was, didn't know what date it was, or even what year it was. All I knew was to move down the slope, away from the bunker. For the next 4 days, Jessica moved mostly at night, navigating by the stars and steadily descending in a southerly direction. She drank water from streams, ate berries and edible roots she had learned to recognize during her years of captivity. During the day, she hid under fallen trees or in dense thickets. I knew the roads were down there somewhere, that's all, she explained. I needed to find people before he got better. Amazingly, even in her exhausted state, Jessica hiked about 52 miles of rugged terrain before reaching the Pineview gas and grocery gas station on the evening of October 12th. Survival experts with the U.S. Forest Service note that such a feat requires not only physical endurance, but also considerable wilderness orienteering skills. The information received from Jessica launched one of the most complex search operations in Oregon history. A special task force made up of FBI agents, Forest Service rangers, and local law enforcement began methodically scanning the area. We were working with 3 types of data, explained Special Agent Robert Nelson, coordinator of the search operation. First, Jessica's subjective descriptions, landmarks, terrain features, directions, and distances. Second, objective geographic information, topography, hydrology, vegetation types. Third, behavioral analysis, how a person with a presumed abductor profile chooses a place to hide. Based on this data, the analysis team identified 7 possible bunker locations within a 15-mile radius of the Palmer sisters' original staging area. Particular attention was paid to areas with specific terrain features mentioned by Jessica: a distinctive bend in the creek, a rocky outcropping resembling a bear's head, a clearing with unusually tall ferns. The breakthrough in the investigation came from the innovative use of historical satellite imagery. Dr. Sarah Livingston, a remote sensing specialist at the California Institute of Technology, developed an algorithm that identifies vegetation anomalies. Even the most cautious person moving regularly along the same route leaves a trail, Dr. Livingston explains. Dimpled grass recovers differently. Disturbed soil has a different moisture and temperature. These subtle differences are invisible to the human eye, but the algorithm can detect them. The analysis revealed a subtle pattern of vegetation disturbance that occurred every few weeks in a remote northwestern section of the search area. The sequence of changes corresponded to regular human movements to and from a fixed point. On November 12th, after 3 weeks of methodical search operations, an FBI tactical team discovered what they were looking for: an entrance to an underground shelter masterfully disguised as a natural rock formation. Agent Michael Donovan, who first spotted the anomaly, describes, "It was a perfect imitation of a natural environment. The moss growing on the surface had been transplanted from the surrounding area. The contours of the hatch exactly followed the natural topography of the rock. The entrance hatch was protected by a complex locking mechanism that required a specific sequence of actions to open. It took the engineering team more than 3 hours to gain access without disturbing potential evidence. What was discovered inside both confirmed Jessica's story and indicated that the situation was far more serious than originally thought. The bunker was empty, Agent Christopher Reynolds, head of the investigative team, notes in his report. The kidnapper had clearly left it in a hurry, probably shortly after Jessica's escape. However, he left behind numerous traces of his activities. A hastily abandoned shortwave radio, tuned to a frequency used by search and rescue services, was found in the main chamber. On the west wall was an extensive map of the Black Ridge National Forest with marked trails and suggested ranger patrol routes. A wall covered with markings caught the investigators' particular attention. Vertical lines grouped 5 at a time, creating a calendar of sorts. One section clearly counted down the days, while another appeared to track violations. The letters M and J were painted next to some of the marks. We found an exact match to Jessica's descriptions, confirms forensic scientist Emily Chang. The layout of the rooms, the ventilation system, even the location of the corroded bolt through which she made her escape. It irrefutably corroborates her testimony. The most disturbing find, however, awaited investigators in a narrow crawl space hidden behind food storage shelves. There, in a waterproof plastic container, the team found a collection of personal documents, driver's licenses from 7 different people who had gone missing in the area over the past decade. Among the documents was Melissa Palmer's student ID, Agent Reynolds confirms. We also recovered a bloody piece of fabric that experts later identified as a fragment of the jacket she was wearing the day she disappeared. Forensic teams spent more than 4 days in the bunker, methodically documenting every inch of the space. They documented depressions in the ground and metal attachment points consistent with the containment system Jessica described. Luminol testing revealed extensive traces of blood, especially in the area Jessica referred to as the penalty pit. Subsequent DNA analysis confirmed that some samples matched Melissa Palmer's DNA profile from her toothbrush, which had been preserved by her parents. Other samples belonged to previously unidentified individuals. We obtained 4 separate DNA profiles, reports forensic scientist Dr. Jason Kim. One matches Melissa Palmer. The other 3 we're trying to identify by comparing to the National Missing Persons database. The discovery of the bunker was a turning point in the case, confirming investigators' worst suspicions and opening a new chapter in the search. They now knew for certain that the mountain existed, that its hideout was real, and that, very likely, the Palmer sisters were not its only victims. But the main question remained unanswered. Where was the kidnapper himself now? And did he have any other captives? The operation to capture one of the most elusive criminals in Oregon history was entering a decisive phase. Special Agent Diane Crawford sits at her desk in the FBI field office in Portland. Photographs, ballistics reports, and a printout of military records are spread out in front of her. On the computer screen is the personnel file of Sergeant Gabriel Thorne, a survival instructor with the 101st Airborne Division of the U.S. Army, discharged in 1997. The wall clock reads 3 o'clock in the morning. Outside the window is a drenching November rain. "We found you," Crawford pronounces, looking at a photograph of a muscular man with a hard stare and military bearing. The identification of the man known to Jessica Palmer as the Mountain came on the 38th day of the investigation, when the forensics team recovered a partial fingerprint from the metal handle of the ventilation hatch in the bunker. The print, partially preserved in rust, matched a sample from military records. Gabriel Thorne, 45 years old, analyst Brian Chen reported in an emergency task force meeting. A specialist in survival under extreme conditions, participated in operations in Panama and the First Gulf War, noted for exceptional orienteering and tactical camouflage skills, discharged for health reasons after a psychological evaluation that revealed, quote, growing distrust of civilian authorities and paranoid tendencies. Thorne's last known residence was a small rented house in the town of Willow Creek, Idaho. Neighbors described him as withdrawn but polite, often absent for weeks at a time. He was interested in alternative medicine and theories of survival after global disasters, collected books on military history and primitive skills. He disappeared from all radar about 11 years ago, Chen continues. Sold most of his possessions, closed his bank accounts, hasn't been officially listed anywhere since. No tax returns, no medical records, no utility bills. A classic case of voluntary disappearance from society. The scale of the operation to find Thorne is unprecedented for the state of Oregon. A joint task force including FBI agents, Oregon, Washington, and Idaho State Police, U.S. Forest Service officials, and behavioral analysis unit specialists are coordinating from a temporary command center deployed in Portland. We're working with 3 concentric search zones, explained Special Agent Robert Nelson, pointing to a map. The near zone is a 50-mile radius from the detected bunker. Middle, areas consistent with his behavioral profile, including remote areas of national forests in 3 states. Far, possible escape routes and international ports of exit. The breakthrough comes on the 23rd day of the search, when a hunting store owner in northern Idaho identifies Thorne from a photograph. A man matching the description had purchased a substantial supply of ammunition, canned goods, and medical supplies 3 weeks earlier. Payment was made in cash. Analysis of surveillance footage traces the movement of a white Ford pickup truck without license plates toward the Selkirk Range, near the Canadian border. The area is one of the most rugged in the continental United States, known for its untouched forests and minimal human presence. On December 5, 2005, at 7 hours and 12 minutes in the morning, a search helicopter detects a thermal anomaly in an abandoned mining camp located 16 miles from the nearest road. Infrared sensors reveal the heat source underground, in the vicinity of a dilapidated adit. "We've found its lair," the pilot reports over a secure radio link. An 18-man assault team, including members of the FBI tactical unit, reaches the site 4 hours later. An old mining tunnel, partially collapsed and overgrown, leads into an expanded underground space clearly designed for extended stay. The camouflaged entrance is protected by a makeshift alarm system. A wire strung at ankle level is connected to bells deeper in the tunnel. "Gabriel Thorne, Federal Bureau of Investigation, you are surrounded," comes through the megaphone. In response, a single shot is fired from deep within the tunnel. For the next 4 hours, the agents negotiate, trying to convince Thorne to surrender. Various tactics are used, appealing to his military background, promising medical attention, mentioning his outstanding survival skills. Thorne responds sporadically, his speech becoming increasingly incoherent. "They don't understand. The system is collapsing. I trained them. Only the strongest will survive," the negotiators write down. At 13 hours and 42 minutes, a deafening explosion comes from the depths of the adit. The ground shakes. Clouds of dust erupt from the entrance. Thorne has detonated a pre-prepared explosive device, bringing down tons of rock. 7 days later, after clearing the rubble, experts recover charred remains. DNA testing confirms it's Gabriel Thorne. Items found on him include a military badge, a collection of handmade knives, and a waterproof notebook filled with coded notes. He took with him more questions than answers, Agent Crawford summarizes. We will never know the full extent of his crimes or his true motives. Parallel to the hunt for Thorne, another investigation is unfolding in the Black Ridge Mountains. Based on information from Jessica and forensic evidence from the bunker, search teams using ground-penetrating radar and specially trained cadaver dogs are surveying the surrounding area. On January 7, 2006, they discover the first grave, a shallow burial on a northeastern slope about 3 miles from the bunker. The remains are identified as belonging to David Morrison, a hiker from Seattle who went missing in May 1998. 3 days later, a second grave is found, containing the remains of Linda and James Watts, a married couple who disappeared while hiking in July of 2298. Their 15-year case, previously categorized as a presumed accident, finally gets a resolution. The toughest find awaits investigators on January 14th, when a third grave is discovered in a small ravine covered with rocks and branches. Dental records and DNA testing confirm the remains belong to Melissa Palmer. We believe her death occurred approximately 26 months ago, notes forensic scientist Dr. Emily Chang. This is consistent with the timeline provided by Jessica and her description of Melissa's last escape attempt. The investigation of the Mounties case formally ends in March of 2006, leaving behind a wave of changes in the Wilderness Missing Person Search System. This case exposed critical gaps in our protocols, acknowledges Oregon Department of Law Enforcement Director Michael Henderson. Lack of coordination between jurisdictions, inadequate resources for long-term searches, lack of systems to link extinctions occurring in different parks and preserves. Robert and Karen Palmer are transforming their grief into action. Using insurance proceeds and public donations, they are establishing the Melissa Palmer Foundation, a nonprofit organization advocating for improved safety in national parks and wilderness areas. We can't bring Melissa back, Robert Palmer says at a press conference, but we can prevent similar tragedies in the future. The Foundation's initiatives include installing emergency beacons on popular hiking trails, expanding cell phone coverage in remote areas, and implementing mandatory tracking protocols for solo and group hikers entering national forests. For Jessica Palmer, the road to recovery is long and difficult. She is going through years of specialized trauma therapy, gradually regaining her physical and psychological health. Recovery is not a linear process, explains her therapist, Dr. Elizabeth Huang. Some days progress is evident, and other days the trauma returns with renewed vigor. It's important to recognize both as part of the same journey. To the surprise of many, Jessica has not turned her back on the wilderness. On the contrary, 3 years after her rescue, she begins working as a consultant for wilderness safety programs, contributing to training protocols for search and rescue teams. Her expertise is invaluable, notes Thomas Reeves, now director of the Oregon Rescue Training Center. She helps us recognize the differences between natural extinctions and those where human error may be present. Her intuition and knowledge have saved several lives already. Federal agencies, including the FBI, National Park Service, and U.S. Forest Service, are working together to develop a new set of rules, informally called the Palmer Protocol. It sets standards for wilderness disappearance investigations, including extended active search periods, comprehensive evidence preservation, and regular review of old cases. On October 10, 2010, exactly 5 years after Jessica's return, a memorial viewing ceremony is held on Black Ridge Mountain. Hundreds of people, including families of other victims, law enforcement, and ordinary citizens, gather to honor the victims and celebrate the strength of the survivors. Jessica Palmer, now a confident woman of 33, addresses the crowd. Her voice is firm as she recites the words that later became the motto of the Melissa Palmer Foundation. "Wild nature didn't take my sister, man did. And we should never blame the mountains for the human monsters that hide in them. Nature is neutral in its beauty and danger, but we humans make the choice to protect or harm." By the year 2015, the Palmer Protocol, adopted by most federal and state agencies, shows significant results. Statistics record 11 cases where missing hikers have been found alive, thanks to new procedures for enhanced searches and interagency coordination. The Palmer sisters' story is changing not only official protocols, but also the public consciousness. Travel guides now include expanded sections on safety. Educational programs in schools teach about proper wilderness behavior. Technology companies are developing new tracking devices that work in remote areas without cell phone service. "Something important was born out of this tragedy," reflects Agent Crawford, now teaching a course on investigating disappearances at the FBI Academy. "Systemic change that saves lives. It's the best way to honor those we've lost." Each summer, Melissa Palmer Foundation volunteers patrol the trails of the Black Ridge National Forest, offering hikers information, checking emergency beacons, providing an extra layer of safety. Their uniforms bear an emblem depicting a mountain compass and the words, "Find your way home."